One of the most fundamental shifts in ICAG 6R3 is the movement from prescription to principles. R2 was very checklist driven, telling sponsors what to do in specific situations. Whereas R3 steps back and says, well, let's focus on the why and trust the sponsors can implement processes that are proportionate to the risk and complexity of their trial. This opens the door to a lot of flexibility and innovation and scalability, but it also puts more pressure on the sponsors to justify their decision and to document them appropriately. The second big shift is a stronger focus on data governance. So R3 introduces an entirely new section on the data lifecycle, from capture to processing to retention to archiving. This includes expectations for traceability, integrity, and system validation as well. It's not enough to say that your data is accurate. You need to show how your systems, processes, and vendors are all aligned to protect data that lives across the entire lifecycle. Thirdly, we see an increased clarity around roles and responsibilities. So R3 reinforces a critical point. Sponsors can delegate responsibilities, but they cannot delegate accountability. So whether it's a CRO, a lab, a software vendor, or a cloud platform, the sponsor must maintain documented and active oversight. This is a major change in how we think about vendor relationships and about operational control, clinical trials, and your data. Next, there's a greater emphasis on computerized systems. So unlike R2, which treated IT a little bit like a black box, R3 calls it out directly. Systems like EDC, eConsent, RTSM, CTMSs, even the APIs and the audit trails that connect these systems, they're now squarely in scope of this guideline. All of these must be validated, access controlled, and compliant. And that means that IT is essentially no longer a supporting player, but is now part of that compliance engine. So all of these really bring us to the central theme of today's discussion, which is calling out the gray zone, right? These are responsibilities that don't sit neatly in one department. They live within clinical, IT, and quality, and procurement to a certain extent as well. And those are exactly where risks tend to hide, where things get missed, and where being proactive and having collaborative oversight is essentially not just a nice to have anymore, but really a requirement of the new E6 guideline. The reality is R3 expects a level of coordination that doesn't always map clearly to an org chart. So let's start with, let's say, data governance and data lifecycle. So this is no longer about entering clean data and SDVing that towards the end of the study. It's about understanding how your data flows, where it's stored, how it's transformed, and how data traceability is maintained. That takes a blend of clinical data management knowledge, but also quality systems expertise, as well as now increasingly data engineering and metadata fluency. These skills often sit in different teams, but R3 basically requires them to converge around a standard understanding of data integrity. Next, computerized system oversight. So validating a GXP system used to live with either an IT generalist or with that quality, or even system administrators could have executed some of those tasks. But it requires GXP validation skills, technical architecture knowledge, and understanding of how the system supports the end process. So you really need to be able to speak all three languages, the clinical operations piece, what's technically possible, and then what's compliant and what's auto. Then there's blinding and randomization integrity. So that's another area that demands multidisciplinary input. The logic of randomization, they might be written by a statistician, but implemented by a vendor and then enforced by a system or procedures. But ensuring it works correctly without unintentionally blinding, that takes some understanding of protocol design, system logic, risk management, and it spans across clinical science, trial management, and quality assurance skill sets. And lastly, backup and control. So this might sound purely in IT's wheelhouse, but R3 places this squarely in the realm of regulated oversight. So you need cybersecurity experts, but you also need GXP trained professionals who understand what regulators expect, especially when a breach occurs and how data is being restored. So it's not enough to run penetration tests. You actually need people who understand the technical controls and the regulatory evidence requirements that are going to be needed to maintain auditability. And what jumps out immediately is how many of these responsibilities are shared across multiple functions, especially in those gray zone areas like data lifecycle management, validation, vendor oversight. That overlap is essentially by design. It's necessary, but it also creates a lot of different challenges. No single team has all the skill sets required to execute all these tasks completely and efficiently, but leads to the potential of duplicated work, unclear handoffs, or even gaps in oversight, all of which kind of increases your regulatory risk. So take something like blinding or audit trails. These require input for clinical quality and IT. But if you don't have clearly defined workflows and integrated tools, you can end up with three different groups chasing the same issue from three different angles, and potentially worse, leading to things and items getting missed altogether.
The first question is, as a smaller company, how do I force my CRO to abide by my requirements if they're different from like bigger partners or bigger pharma companies?
So the short answer is you can't force your CROs to do anything, but it's really about how you set up your governance program of how you're managing your CROs and your vendors completely as well. You could put procedures or policies in place, governance oversight over your CROs, held them to account. You need to potentially start building in some of these oversight items into your contracts with your CROs, and then ensure that the CROs that you select, they fall within the guidelines and standards that you're setting up.
And they actually, the YCH regulation talks about a few things like that. Sponsor is responsible for oversight of all third parties. So your CRO isn't responsible for any issues that happen. They're not responsible at all. Sponsor is. And that's spelled out in this agreement.
Yeah, essentially the model is a centralized coordination model. Really, it doesn't. The central hub necessarily doesn't own the entire process, but does own the standards in which the other functions are working against. So if you think about it kind of like as a wheel and spoke model, in the central area, you have the governance function, and then at the outside of the spokes, you've got your TPRM teams, your quality groups, your clinical groups, etc. So it really becomes siloed, and you can have the same thing going on in your clinical space or in your IT space. So you have your vendor manager process really be fragmented across the different domains that you have, and then have each one of them running a slightly different process, which, especially with E6R3, you see, isn't going to allow for efficient execution of compliance against that guideline. I think the real takeaway is that this isn't just necessarily a regulatory update. It's kind of a call to action. And there's a couple ways that you can prepare yourself and your organization. Firstly, what we would recommend is conducting a gap assessment against R3. So don't assume that your current SOPs and your oversight models are sufficient. Really map the current state to the new guideline, especially across those gray zone areas. R3 kind of makes it clear that the oversight must be structured, documented, and completely risk-based, and is going to require collaboration across the entire organization. And I was missed one. There's a number 5. Finally, foster a culture of shared accountability. So across clinical, quality, IT, procurement, and every third party that you rely on, the compliance of those parties are not something that's completely out of your control. You can't influence them, and building that trust and visibility and the risk management into your vendor ecosystem is going to provide big dividends moving forward.